The churn of tank tracks across the frozen earth became a rhythmic, grinding testament to the relentless push forward. Winter had clamped its grip on the landscape, turning every movement into an arduous battle against both the enemy and the elements. For the 3rd Armored Battalion, spearheading a critical advance, the stakes were impossibly high. Their mission demanded speed, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to momentum. Each tank, a behemoth of steel and firepower, carried the hopes of an entire front. Yet, beneath the armor and the roar of engines, a silent, insidious threat began to emerge, threatening to halt their advance more effectively than any enemy fire. The first signs were subtle. A tank would unexpectedly slow, its powerful engine struggling under a sudden, inexplicable strain. Then, the telltale clanking, a rhythmic disruption in the metallic symphony of the tracks. Soon after, the vehicle would grind to a complete stop, a stranded leviathan in the vast, unforgiving expanse. The crews, exhausted and perpetually on edge, knew the routine. They would dismount, their breath misting in the frigid air, to inspect the massive track assemblies. The problem was almost always the same. A critical pin within the bogie wheel suspension system had sheared. These pins, designed to absorb immense shock and distribute the tank's colossal weight, were failing at an alarming rate. Sergeant Arthur Finch, a quiet man with hands perpetually stained with oil and grease, watched these breakdowns with a growing sense of dread. He was a master mechanic, his understanding of the tanks extending far beyond the schematics. He knew their every groan, their every shudder, the subtle language of their mechanical health. He had seen the official replacement pins, sturdy enough in theory, but clearly not designed for the sustained, brutal punishment inflicted by this particular terrain and the relentless pace of their advance. Each failed pin meant hours of repair in exposed conditions, diverting precious manpower and resources. More critically, each immobilized tank represented a gaping hole in the battalion's formation, a vulnerability that could cost lives. The supply lines, already stretched thin by the rapid advance, struggled to keep pace with the demand for these specific components. Requisitions for more robust pins, or even just a larger quantity of the standard ones, ascended the chain of command, only to be met with bureaucratic slowness. Paperwork moved at its own deliberate pace, utterly detached from the immediate life-or-death urgency unfolding on the front. Finch saw the frustration etched on the faces of the tank commanders, the weary resignation of the repair crews. He understood the strategic implications. If the battalion stalled, the entire offensive could collapse. The enemy would gain precious time to reinforce their positions, and the sacrifices already made would be in vain. His own repair teams worked tirelessly, often through the night, replacing the broken pins with the few spares they possessed. They tried reinforcing them, welding plates, but the core issue remained. The pins themselves were simply not holding up. Each repair felt like a temporary reprieve, a band-aid on a gushing wound. Finch walked amongst the crippled tanks, observing the points of fracture. He ran his calloused fingers over the jagged edges of the broken steel, feeling the stress points, almost hearing the metallic scream of fatigue. He understood that simply replacing the component with an identical, equally flawed part was not a solution. It was a cycle of failure. The cold bit deep, and the constant threat of enemy patrols added another layer of tension to their already arduous work. Finch saw the toll it was taking on everyone. The exhaustion was palpable, the morale beginning to fray. He watched a young crewman trying to pry a seized track link, his hands raw and bleeding in the biting wind. The image burned into Finch's mind. There had to be another way. The official channels offered no immediate hope. The standard operating procedures, designed for a different war, a different pace, were failing them. One evening, as the last rays of a weak winter sun bled across the snow, Finch found himself examining a discarded piece of equipment. It was a mundane object, perhaps part of an old crate, secured by a large, thick nail, its surface pitted with rust but its core surprisingly strong. He picked it up, feeling its weight, its rigidity. His mind was still replaying the mechanics of the bogie wheel's failure, the shearing force, the rotational stress. He turned the rusted nail over in his fingers, his brow furrowed in concentration. The official pins were machined with precision, but their material composition seemed inadequate for the specific, sustained impact they were enduring. This nail, crude as it was, possessed a different kind of strength, a resilience born of simpler metallurgy. The idea, at first, seemed audacious, almost absurd, to replace a precisely engineered component with something so utterly rudimentary. But the desperation of their situation, the looming threat of the battalion becoming completely immobilized, pushed him past conventional thinking. He began to sketch in the dirt with a gloved finger, tracing the path of force, the exact dimensions of the failed pin. He looked at the nail again, then at the skeletal remains of a broken bogie. The dimensions were not exact, but they were close enough for a desperate attempt. He knew the risks. Any improvised repair could fail, potentially causing even greater damage or worse, putting lives at risk. His superiors might dismiss his idea as reckless, an insult to engineering standards. He would face skepticism, perhaps even ridicule. But the alternative, watching the battalion slowly grind to a halt, was unacceptable. The grinding halts of the tanks, the silent frustration of the crews, the chilling prospect of a stalled advance, these were the forces that propelled him. He began to gather what little scrap metal and rudimentary tools he could find, his mind already racing through the steps of his unconventional repair. The cold wind howled around him, a stark reminder of the unforgiving environment, but a flicker of hope, born of pure ingenuity, had begun to ignite in the quiet mechanic's mind. Sergeant Finch worked mostly in the dim light of a canvas-covered repair tent, or sometimes under the vast, indifferent sky. His initial quest was for material. The rusted nail, a spark for the idea, was merely a starting point. He needed more. He began sifting through piles of discarded equipment, the flotsam of a rapidly moving front. Bent axles, broken tool handles, fragments of machinery too damaged for conventional repair. Each piece was scrutinized. He sought resilience, a specific kind of tensile strength that the official pins lacked. He found it in unlikely places: sections of reinforcing bar from demolished structures, heavy-duty bolts from abandoned transport trucks, even the hardened steel from a discarded shovel handle. These were materials not designed for precision, but for brute force and enduring stress. His tools were rudimentary: a heavy hammer, a portable forge jury-rigged from a metal drum and a hand-cranked blower, a crude anvil fashioned from a tank track link. He worked with methodical intensity, often through the coldest parts of the night when the camp was quietest. His breath plumed in the frigid air as he heated the scavenged metal, the flickering orange glow of the forge casting dancing shadows around him. He hammered, shaped, and filed. The challenge was immense. The original pins were precisely machined to fit within the bogie wheel assembly, allowing for smooth rotation and absorbing the tremendous impact of the tank's movement. Finch's improvised replacements had to approximate this function, but with material that was inherently less cooperative. He started with the most promising piece he had found, a section of rebar, thicker than the original pin but with a dense, unyielding core. He heated it until it was malleable, then, with painstaking effort, began to reduce its diameter, shaping it with blows from his hammer against the makeshift anvil. The process was slow, arduous, and physically demanding. Each strike was a testament to his resolve, a direct challenge to the problem that threatened to paralyze his battalion. He had to ensure the diameter was consistent enough to slide into the housing, but not so tight as to seize, nor so loose as to allow excessive play. The ends needed to be shaped to prevent slippage, to hold the assembly together under immense dynamic load. His first few attempts were crude, misshapen. The steel, unaccustomed to such precise manipulation with hand tools, resisted. Some pieces cracked under the hammer, others cooled too quickly, becoming too hard to work. Finch didn't see these as failures, but as data points, each one teaching him something new about the material and his approach. He learned to control the heat, to anticipate the steel's resistance, to find the rhythm that would coax it into the desired form. He experimented with different tempering methods, plunging the glowing metal into barrels of snow-melted water, trying to achieve a balance between hardness and flexibility. This was engineering born of necessity, stripped down to its most fundamental elements. One frigid afternoon, he finished what he felt was his most promising prototype. It was not elegant, it was rough, scarred by the hammer and the fire, but it possessed a raw, undeniable strength. He needed to test it. He couldn't risk testing it on an active tank, not yet. He found a discarded bogey wheel assembly, ripped from a tank that had taken a direct hit. The housing for the pin was intact, a perfect, static test bed. He carefully removed the remains of the sheared official pin and, with a few precise taps, inserted his creation. It fit. Not perfectly, but snugly enough. He rotated the wheel, listening for any binding, feeling for any excessive friction. It moved. It was a small victory, but a significant one. His work did not go entirely unnoticed. Specialist Miller, one of his junior mechanics, a young man with a sharp eye for detail, often found Finch working late. Miller initially watched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Sergeant," he ventured one night, his voice hushed, "what exactly are you doing with those things?" Finch explained in his quiet, understated way the problem with the official pins, his theory about the material, and his attempt to forge a solution from scrap. Miller, initially skeptical, saw the logic, the desperation. He began to assist, holding pieces steady, manning the bellows, a silent accomplice in the unorthodox endeavor. Their shared secret created a bond, a sense of quiet defiance against the growing tide of despair. The official supply situation continued to deteriorate. Reports from the forward companies were grim. More tanks were immobilizing, their crews exposed, their positions compromised. The battalion commander, a stern but pragmatic man, held daily briefings where the lack of replacement parts was a constant, frustrating refrain. Requisitions were still trapped in the bureaucratic labyrinth, moving at a pace utterly out of sync with the demands of the front. The existing spare pins were dwindling rapidly. The prospect of the entire battalion being brought to a standstill was becoming a very real, terrifying possibility. The strategic implications were catastrophic. Finch felt the weight of this urgency pressing down on him. Each failed tank track was a silent accusation, a testament to the system's inability to adapt. He refined his design, learning from each iteration. He discovered that by slightly flaring the ends of his improvised pins, he could create a more secure fit, reducing lateral movement and distributing stress more effectively. He also developed a method for quickly shaping the ends using a modified chisel and the heavy hammer, streamlining the production process. The rusted nail had evolved. It was no longer a simple nail, but a meticulously crafted, if crudely made, engineering solution, born of intuition and grit. The true test would be under dynamic load. He needed a tank, a real one, to prove his concept. He approached Lieutenant Davies, the officer in charge of the repair section. Davies was a stickler for regulations, a man who believed implicitly in the chain of command and approved procurement channels. Finch laid out his case, presenting his rough-hewn pins alongside a broken official one. He explained his observations, his theory, and the dire situation. Davies examined the improvised pin, his brow furrowed. "Sergeant," he said, his voice laced with concern, "this is highly irregular. We cannot deviate from approved specifications. What about liability? What if it fails?" Finch met his gaze, unwavering. "Lieutenant, the approved specifications are failing us. We have no pins. The battalion is stalling. What is the liability in doing nothing? What is the cost of waiting for a requisition that may never arrive in time?" His words, though quiet, carried the undeniable weight of truth. Davies hesitated. He knew the situation in the field was critical. He had seen the reports, the mounting number of immobilized tanks. He was torn between his duty to procedure and the stark reality of their predicament. He paced the small tent, his eyes darting from Finch to the crude yet undeniably robust piece of steel. The decision was agonizing, but the situation on the front was becoming untenable. Another 3 tanks had broken down that morning, their positions now dangerously exposed. The official supply truck, due days ago, was still nowhere to be seen. Davies, his face grim, finally gave a reluctant nod. "All right, Sergeant. 1 tank, a non-critical one if possible. You will document every step. If there is any structural damage, any failure, it stops immediately. And this stays between us, for now. If this gets out, we could both be in serious trouble." Finch understood the risk. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the trust, however grudging, that had been placed in him. He chose a tank from a support company, one that had been immobilized for 2 days with a sheared pin, awaiting a replacement that would never come. It was a beast, scarred by battle, its tracks caked with frozen mud. With Miller's help, and under the watchful, anxious eye of Lieutenant Davies, Finch set to work. The process of replacing the pin was familiar, but this time, the component he was installing was his own creation. He carefully aligned the bogie wheel, inserted the rebar pin, and secured it. It was crude, but it held. The moment of truth arrived as the tank's engine roared to life. The tracks began to turn, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. They watched, holding their breath as the tank moved forward, then reversed, traversing a short, uneven stretch of ground. The bogie wheel, now held by Finch's improvised pin, rotated, absorbed impact, and performed its function. There was no grinding, no unusual clanking. It was a tentative success, a fragile flicker of hope in the deepening gloom. But one test, on 1 tank, was not enough. The true challenge would be sustained movement, under combat conditions, across the brutal, frozen landscape. The battalion was still in peril, and Finch knew his work was far from over. He had proven his concept, but now he had to scale it, and convince others that his unconventional solution was their only path forward. The tension of waiting, of knowing the fate of the battalion hung in the balance, was almost unbearable. The tentative success on the single tank, though a profound relief, was merely a first step. Lieutenant Davies watched the hulking machine disappear into the twilight, a knot of apprehension still tightening in his stomach. He had authorized a grave breach of protocol, a gamble with potentially catastrophic consequences. If Finch's improvisation failed, Davies' career would be over, and the lives of the crew could be forfeit. Yet the alternative, watching the battalion disintegrate under the weight of mechanical failure, was a certainty he could not accept. He knew he was walking a fine line, protecting Finch's unorthodox initiative while simultaneously trying to manage the fallout if it went wrong. His silence, his complicity, weighed heavily. Sergeant Finch, however, could not afford such introspection. The single successful test only intensified the urgency. 1 pin was not enough. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, would be needed to keep the battalion operational. The bitter cold of the night saw him return to his improvised forge, the flickering light of the flames illuminating his determined face. Specialist Miller, now fully committed, worked alongside him, their rhythmic hammering a defiant counterpoint to the distant rumble of artillery. They scoured the ravaged landscape for more raw material, their eyes trained for any discarded metal that possessed the necessary resilience. They learned to identify the subtle differences in steel, the way certain alloys reacted to heat and hammer, becoming adept at discerning potential in what others saw as junk. The challenge of scaling production was immense. Each pin required meticulous shaping, hours of hammering and tempering. Finch experimented with ways to speed up the process without compromising integrity. He devised crude jigs to hold the hot metal, allowing Miller to assist more effectively with the shaping. they modified discarded tools, turning a broken wrench into a lever for bending, a damaged pickaxe head into a better anvil surface. Their repair tent became a clandestine factory, a haven of ingenuity operating just beneath the radar of official scrutiny. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot metal, a testament to their relentless toil. Word of the worsening track situation spread like wildfire through the battalion. More tanks were reporting failures, and the morale of the crews was plummeting. The official spare parts were now virtually exhausted. Commanders were forced to cannibalize parts from already immobilized tanks, further reducing their operational capacity. The advance, once a surging torrent, was threatening to become a stagnant pool. The enemy, sensing a weakness, began to increase their probing attacks, adding another layer of pressure to the already desperate situation. Every lost tank, every delayed repair, meant more exposure, more vulnerability. Lieutenant Davies, now fully invested, became Finch's protector and a crucial facilitator. He started subtly diverting resources, securing extra fuel for the forge, arranging for small necessary supplies that wouldn't raise suspicion. He would intercept inquiries from higher command about the dwindling spare parts, offering vague assurances while buying Finch more time. He walked a constant tightrope, his every interaction a calculated risk. He knew that if the battalion stalled, the blame would fall squarely on the supply chain. But if Finch's unauthorized solution was discovered and failed, the consequences would be severe for all involved. The first field deployment of Finch's pins came out of sheer necessity. A forward company reported 3 tanks immobilized simultaneously, their positions dangerously exposed. There were no official pins left. Davies, bypassing standard requisition channels, ordered Finch and Miller to the front. They traveled under the cover of darkness, their makeshift pins carefully concealed. The atmosphere at the forward position was grim. The crews exhausted and on edge, their faces etched with anxiety. The sight of the 2 mechanics carrying not crates of official spares but a canvas bag full of rough-hewn metal was met with a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. Captain Jenkins, the company commander, a battle-hardened officer with a deep distrust of anything not by the book, eyed Finch's creations with open suspicion. "Sergeant," he stated, his voice flat, "you expect me to put my men's lives on the line with these?" He held up one of Finch's rebar pins, its surface scarred by hammer blows and fire, a stark contrast to the smooth, precisely machined official part. Finch, with quiet authority, explained his findings, his theory, and the undeniable fact that the official pins had failed. He spoke not of engineering principles, but of necessity, of the material strength he had found where others saw only scrap. Jenkins, seeing no other option, reluctantly agreed. The repairs were harrowing. Working under the constant threat of enemy fire, the mechanics labored in the biting wind, their hands numb with cold. Specialist Miller, his initial apprehension replaced by growing confidence, worked with surprising speed and dexterity. Finch guided him, his eyes constantly scanning the environment, his ears tuned to the distant sounds of battle. They replaced the sheared pins in the 3 tanks, their movements efficient and practiced. The crews watched, their faces grim, a silent question hanging in the frigid air. Would these strange, rough pins hold? The first tank rumbled to life, its tracks churning through the frozen earth, then the second, and the third. Jenkins watched, his expression unreadable as the tanks moved, tested their tracks, and then slowly began to maneuver back into their defensive positions. A palpable wave of relief, silent but profound, washed over the crews. The pins held, the tanks moved. It was not a grand victory, but a quiet, essential one. The immediate threat was averted. Jenkins, without a word, gave Finch a curt nod, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible solution. News of the sergeant's solution began to spread through the battalion, whispered from crew to crew, not as an official directive, but as a rumor, a lifeline. The rusted nail repair, as some began to call it, became a symbol of defiance against the overwhelming odds. More requests for Finch's pins flooded Davies's makeshift repair depot. The demand was insatiable. Finch and Miller worked almost continuously, their bodies aching, their hands raw, fueled by strong, bitter coffee and the sheer will to keep their comrades moving. The physical toll was immense. Finch rarely slept more than a few hours, his mind constantly racing, analyzing, refining. Miller, though younger, was equally exhausted, his movements becoming mechanical. Davies, too, bore the strain, the constant pressure of concealing their operation, of justifying their unofficial methods. They were a small, beleaguered team, fighting a battle on two fronts, against the enemy and against the crushing inertia of a system unable to adapt. Yet, despite the exhaustion, a strange sense of purpose permeated their work. Each pin forged, each tank repaired, was a small, tangible victory against the encroaching despair. They were not just fixing machines, they were restoring hope, preventing further suffering, keeping the advance alive. The crude simplicity of their solution, born of desperation, proved to be its greatest strength. It was robust, adaptable, and, most importantly, available. The relentless churn of the tank tracks, once a sound of impending failure, began to regain its rhythmic, grinding testament to the relentless push forward, thanks to the quiet ingenuity of one mechanic and his team. The sun continued its low arc across the winter sky, marking the passage of the first, then the second day, of their desperate fight against immobility. The sun continued its low arc across the winter sky, marking the passage of the first, then the second day, of their desperate fight against immobility. The success of Finch's pins on Captain Jenkins' tanks was a temporary reprieve, a whisper of hope that traveled faster than any official communique. But with hope came an avalanche of demand. Every company commander whose tanks were grinding to a halt, or whose crews were facing the agonizing wait for non-existent spares, began to send desperate pleas to Lieutenant Davis's repair section. The messages were often understated, couched in official language, but their underlying urgency was unmistakable. They needed pins, and they needed them now. The small repair tent, already a hive of clandestine activity, became a pressure cooker. Lloyd Sergeant Finch and Specialist Miller worked without pause, their faces smudged with soot and oil, their movements becoming a blur of efficiency born of sheer exhaustion. The portable forge glowed almost continuously, its heat a welcome if meager comfort against the biting cold. The rhythmic clang of hammer on makeshift anvil became the new heartbeat of their desperate effort. Miller, once merely an assistant, had developed a keen eye and a steady hand, mirroring Finch's methodical precision. He could now identify the correct temperature for shaping the metal, anticipate its resistance, and achieve a consistent taper with surprising speed. Their partnership was a silent symphony of necessity. Finding raw materials became a daily scavenger hunt, each piece of discarded metal a potential lifeline. They ventured further into abandoned positions, sifting through the wreckage of skirmishes, eyes peeled for anything that could be repurposed. Sections of railway track, heavy-duty construction bolts from collapsed bridges, even the hardened steel from enemy equipment that had been destroyed, each discovery was a small victory. They learned to differentiate between various grades of steel by sight, by the way it rang when struck, by the subtle nuances of its rust. This was not metallurgy taught in manuals, but a practical, intuitive knowledge born of dire need. The physical toll was immense. Finch's hands, already calloused, were now perpetually sore, his muscles screaming from the repetitive, bone-jarring work. Sleep was a luxury they could ill afford, snatched in short, restless intervals on the cold ground, often with the smell of coal smoke still clinging to their clothing. Finch's mind, however, remained sharp, constantly analyzing, refining, seeking marginal gains in efficiency. He developed a system for batch processing, heating multiple pieces of metal simultaneously, then cycling through the shaping and tempering stages. He even fashioned a crude jig that allowed them to quickly cut the scavenged metal to rough size before the detailed shaping began, saving precious minutes on each piece. Lieutenant Davies, meanwhile, was fighting his own battle, a bureaucratic war of attrition. The official supply reports from higher command were a constant source of anxiety. They demanded explanations for the plummeting inventory of standard spare parts, unaware that the parts simply weren't arriving. Davies, a master of obfuscation, would craft vague reports of unforeseen logistical challenges and expedited field repairs, carefully avoiding any mention of Finch's unorthodox solution. He would subtly reroute fuel and rations to Finch's tent, disguising them as supplies for other, less critical maintenance tasks. He knew he was risking everything, but the sight of the battalion's operational strength steadily eroding, the increasing reports of exposed crews and stalled advances outweighed any personal risk. The skepticism from some quarters remained. A visiting staff officer from Quartermaster Corps, making a rare inspection tour, stumbled upon Finch's makeshift forge. He recoiled at the sight of the rough-hewn pins, dismissing them as unauthorized substandard material and an egregious breach of engineering protocol. He threatened to have Finch court-martialed and Davies relieved of command. Davies, with a calm he didn't feel, managed to deflect the immediate threat, arguing the desperate circumstances and promising a full formal inquiry once the immediate crisis had passed. He knew this was merely a temporary reprieve, a ticking clock until the official system caught up. But the field, the brutal reality of the front, was a far more persuasive arbiter than any staff officer. Captain Morales, leading a forward assault company, found his lead tank crippled by a sheared pin during a critical push. Cut off from the main force, his position was rapidly becoming untenable. With no official spares and facing imminent collapse, he remembered the whispers about Finch's rusted nail pins. Desperate, he radioed Davies, bypassing protocol, demanding the improvised parts. Finch and Miller, accompanied by Davies, drove a light utility vehicle under the cover of a freezing fog, carrying a precious cargo of their hand-forged pins. The repair was performed under extreme duress. Enemy fire began to pepper their position, forcing them to work with an urgency that bordered on recklessness. The ground shook with distant explosions, and the air was thick with the smell of cordite. Finch, ignoring the danger, focused with laser-like intensity on the task. Miller, his face grim, held the heavy tools, his body shielding Finch from stray debris. They replaced the pin in record time, their movements honed by endless repetition. As the tank's engine roared to life and its tracks began to churn, Captain Morales, who had been observing with a mix of fear and professional skepticism, felt a surge of relief. He watched as the tank, now mobile, maneuvered back into the fight, providing crucial cover for his exposed infantry. The crude pin held. It was not elegant, but it was effective. In that moment, the skepticism of the Quartermaster Corps seemed utterly irrelevant. Survival superseded protocol. The incident with Captain Morales' company became a turning point. The rusted nail repair was no longer a secret whispered among mechanics. It was a proven, life-saving solution. Tank crews who had once viewed the rough-hewn pins with apprehension now actively requested them. They understood that these weren't merely replacements. They were an adaptation, a response to a flaw in the original design that the official channels had failed to address. The pins were holding up under the brutal conditions, often outperforming their factory-made counterparts. Their rough appearance, once a mark of their improvised nature, became a symbol of their resilience. The second day bled into the third, and the battalion continued its advance, albeit painstakingly. The frozen landscape, once an ally in slowing the enemy, was now a relentless adversary for their machines. The constant vibration, the extreme cold, the sheer weight of the tanks pushing through deep snow and frozen earth continued to stress the bogie wheel systems. Finch and Miller continued their relentless work. Their faces were hollowed by fatigue, their eyes red-rimmed, but their resolve remained unbroken. The rhythm of their hammering, the hiss of the forge, became a defiant anthem against the grinding attrition of war. Davies, caught between the demands of the front and the impending scrutiny from command, found himself increasingly isolated. He was signing off on requisitions for general repair materials that were, in fact, raw steel for Finch's forge. He was making daily reports that carefully omitted the true nature of their repairs, knowing that each word was a calculated risk. The pressure was immense, but he saw the tangible results. The battalion, against all odds, was still moving. The advance, though slow, had not stalled completely. Lives were being saved, positions maintained, all because of the quiet ingenuity of a single mechanic and the desperate courage of a few individuals willing to defy the strictures of the system. The enemy's resistance, while fierce, was beginning to show cracks, largely due to the sustained pressure from the advancing armored units. But the cost was high. Each tank that failed, each moment lost to repair, threatened to tip the balance. The desperate race against time and mechanical failure continued, a testament to the unyielding spirit of those who found solutions where others saw only insurmountable problems. The rusted nail was more than a repair. It was a symbol of audacious resourcefulness, a silent battle waged beneath the roar of engines and the thunder of guns. The critical 3-day window, mentioned in hushed tones, was nearing its end, and the outcome still hung in the balance. The third day dawned, a stark, unforgiving canvas of gray sky and frozen earth. The battalion's advance had slowed to a crawl. The objective, a strategic bridgehead across a partially frozen river, lay less than 10 kilometers ahead. Securing it was paramount for the wider offensive, but every kilometer was a hard-won battle against the terrain and their own failing machinery. The relentless churn of the tracks, once a symbol of their power, was now a constant reminder of their vulnerability. Sergeant Finch and Specialist Miller, their faces gaunt with exhaustion, continued their work. Finch's hands, though aching, moved with a practiced precision born of endless repetition. The rhythm of his hammer on the anvil, the hiss of the quenching metal, had become a dull throb in their ears. They had forged dozens of pins, each one a testament to their unwavering resolve. The small tent was a scene of controlled chaos, piles of scavenged metal shrinking as finished pins accumulated in canvas bags. Miller, no longer just an apprentice but a crucial partner, anticipated Finch's every move, handing him tools, adjusting the bellows, his own technique for shaping the hot metal improving with each piece. Lieutenant Davies, his uniform rumpled, his eyes bloodshot, stood guard over their clandestine operation. The pressure on him was immense. Reports from the front lines were increasingly desperate. Colonel Harding, the battalion commander, a man known for his unflinching pragmatism, had made it clear: the bridgehead must be taken. But his daily status reports were grim, detailing the growing number of immobilized tanks, the dwindling spares, and the inexplicable lack of official replacements. Harding, unaware of Finch's improvisation, demanded answers. Davies continued to offer carefully worded evasions, buying precious hours, knowing that his professional life, perhaps even his freedom, hung by a thread. The quartermaster corps officer, still lurking somewhere in the rear echelons, had followed through on his threat. A formal directive landed on Davies' desk, demanding an immediate inventory of all non-standard equipment and a full explanation for any deviation from approved maintenance procedures. The language was cold, bureaucratic, utterly detached from the life-or-death struggle unfolding at the front. Davies held the paper in his hand, its words a tangible threat. He knew that revealing Finch's work now would invite immediate censure, potentially halting their efforts just as they were needed most. He crumpled the document, tucking it into a pocket, a silent defiance. Then came the order. Colonel Harding called Davies directly. "Lieutenant," Harding's voice was strained, "we have intelligence of an enemy counterattack forming. They intend to reinforce the bridgehead tonight. We must move now. What is your operational strength?" Davies hesitated, He had just received reports of 5 more tanks losing pins. The official spares were gone. Only Finch's pins could keep those tanks moving. "Sir," Davies replied, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands, "we have managed to bring several critical units back online. Our operational strength is precarious, but we can push. We must push." He omitted the crucial detail, the unauthorized nature of the repairs. Harding, sensing the urgency in Davies' tone, gave the order. Full advance. The roar of engines filled the frozen air as the battalion, a steel serpent, began its final, arduous push towards the bridgehead. The ground trembled under the weight of the tanks, their tracks grinding against the ice and frozen earth. Finch and Miller, along with a small team of mechanics, moved with the forward elements, ready for immediate repairs. They carried their canvas bags, now almost empty of raw material for new pins, but full of the hand-forged ones. Each clang of a track, each groan of an engine was scrutinized. The enemy, as predicted, launched a fierce counterattack. Artillery barrages began to fall, shaking the earth, the concussions echoing across the landscape. The advance became a brutal slugfest. Tanks exchanged fire, infantry moved through the snow, and the constant threat of mines and ambushes loomed. It was in this maelstrom that Finch's pins faced their ultimate test. One of the lead tanks, commanded by Captain Morales, hit a concealed charge. The explosion was not large enough to disable the tank, but the shock wave, combined with the extreme stress of the terrain, caused a critical bogey wheel pin to shear. The tank lurched, its movement compromised, its position exposed to enemy machine gun fire. The crew radioed for immediate assistance. Finch and Miller, already close by, moved under cover of the tank's own silhouette, the sound of incoming fire whistling around them. Working under direct fire, their movements were precise, almost automatic. They had done this countless times in the relative safety of the repair tent, but never with bullets impacting the armor just centimeters from their heads. Finch, oblivious to the chaos, focused solely on the damaged track. Miller, his face grim, held a heavy wrench, his body instinctively providing a screen against the shrapnel. They removed the broken pin, its failure a stark reminder of the original design flaw. Finch then, with a few swift, practiced taps, inserted one of his own crude rebar pins. It slid into place, a rough but firm fit. The moment of truth came as Captain Morales, his face etched with anxiety, gave the order to move. The engine roared, the tracks churned. The tank, once crippled, now moved forward, its massive frame returning to the fight, its main gun swiveling to engage the enemy. The improvised pin held, absorbing the enormous forces, performing its vital function. Morales, seeing his tank return to full mobility, felt a profound, silent gratitude. He knew that without that repair, his tank, and perhaps his crew, would have been lost. Throughout the day, similar scenes unfolded across the battalion's front. Tanks that would have been immobilized, left vulnerable, were repaired by Finch's team using his hand-forged pins. The official spares would have run out hours ago. Now, these crude, hammer-beaten pieces of scavenged metal were the only things keeping the steel behemoths rolling. The enemy's counterattack faltered, unable to capitalize on the expected widespread immobilization of the armored units. The tanks, though battered, continued their relentless push. By late afternoon, as the weak winter sun began its descent, the battalion reached the bridgehead. The enemy, having suffered heavy losses and unable to break the armored thrust, began to withdraw. The bridge was secured. The objective was taken. Colonel Harding, standing on a slight rise overlooking the captured position, watched his tanks consolidate their positions. He saw the scars of battle on their armor, but he also saw them moving, functioning, holding the line. He knew, with a certainty that transcended any official report, that something extraordinary had happened. His battalion, against all odds and against all logistical expectations, had maintained its momentum. Davies, exhausted but relieved, stood beside him. Harding turned to him, his gaze intense. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice low, Your reports indicated a critical shortage of bogey wheel pins. Yet, we kept moving. Explain." Davies met his gaze, the crumpled Quartermaster Corps directive heavy in his pocket. He took a deep breath. "Sir," he began, "Sergeant Finch, he found a way." He then, in a quiet, measured tone, explained the problem with the official pins, Finch's ingenious solution, and the desperate, unauthorized effort that had kept the battalion operational. Harding listened, his expression unreadable. He looked from Davies to the tanks still moving across the bridge, then to the distant, smoking battlefields. He understood the implications, the defiance of protocol, the improvisation, the sheer audacity of it all. But he also understood the result. The bridgehead was taken, the advance secured, lives saved. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of duty, regulations, and the stark reality of survival. Sergeant Finch, observing the scene from a distance, felt no surge of pride, no desire for recognition. His hands, raw and aching, still instinctively sought out potential flaws in the passing tanks. His gaze, weary but sharp, scanned the machinery, ready for the next breakdown. He saw the secured bridgehead, the moving tanks, the relieved faces of the crews. That was his reward. The quiet satisfaction of a problem solved, a task completed, a battalion kept moving. The immediate crisis was averted. The advance continued. But the long winter campaign was far from over, and the question of how to reconcile the quiet ingenuity of a single mechanic with the unyielding demands of the military machine remained. A silent yet potent challenge. Colonel Harding's gaze, fixed on Lieutenant Davies, was unblinking. The air between them was charged, heavy with unspoken consequences. Harding was a man who understood the brutal arithmetic of war. Results outweighed methods, especially when lives hung in the balance. He had seen his tanks, battered but mobile, secure the bridgehead against a fierce counterattack that should have crippled them. He had seen the relief on his commanders' faces. He had seen the proof. "Sergeant Finch," Harding repeated, his voice barely a whisper, a name that carried no official weight beyond his immediate unit, yet now represented an undeniable force. And his solution. Davies, emboldened by the truth of their success, explained further. He detailed the critical flaw in the official pins, the relentless failure rate, the dwindling spares, and Finch's quiet, methodical ingenuity. He described the scrap metal, the jury-rigged forge, the painstaking hours, and the silent, desperate tests. He did not ask for leniency, nor did he seek praise. He simply laid out the facts, the stark reality of how a battalion, against all odds, had been kept operational. Harding listened, his eyes occasionally flicking towards the distant rumble of a returning tank, a testament to the very improvisation being discussed. When Davies finished, the colonel remained silent for a long moment. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice now firm, "you acted under extreme duress. The objective was taken. The battalion remains viable. That is the paramount concern." He paused, then added, his tone hardening slightly. "However, this improvisation cannot be officially sanctioned. It deviates too far. It sets a precedent." Davies understood. Harding was acknowledging the necessity, but also protecting the integrity of the system he commanded. "Understood, sir," Davies replied. "Sergeant Finch," Harding continued, his gaze returning to the distant tanks, "will continue his work, quietly, for the duration of this advance. Any official inquiries regarding supply shortages will be routed through my office, and they will receive appropriate responses." It was a clear directive. Finch's innovation would be protected, but it would remain an unspoken, unofficial reality. The system would adapt by looking the other way, a pragmatic concession to a desperate truth. The threat from the Quartermaster Corps officer, though not explicitly mentioned, hung in the air. Davies knew Harding's intervention meant that formal inquiry would be absorbed, deflected, lost in the bureaucratic labyrinth, never reaching Finch or himself with any real force. The immediate crisis was over, but the long winter campaign stretched ahead, a relentless grind against both the enemy and the elements. Sergeant Finch, observing the exchange from a distance, gleaned the essence of the conversation from the colonel's posture, the lieutenant's relieved but solemn nod. He felt no resentment, no desire for acclaim. His satisfaction was complete. The tanks were moving. The bridgehead was secure. His work had held. He simply turned back to his team, already assessing a new batch of scavenged metal, his mind focused on the next potential failure, the next solution. The rusted nail repair, as it became known within the battalion, never made it into official field manuals. No medals were awarded for its invention, no commendations for its implementation. Sergeant Arthur Finch remained a quiet, unassuming mechanic, his hands perpetually stained with oil and grease, his brilliance largely uncelebrated beyond the immediate circle of those whose lives he directly impacted. But its legacy was undeniable. For the remainder of the brutal winter campaign, Finch's improvised pins became the backbone of the 3rd Armored Battalion's mobility. His small, clandestine forge, moved from one temporary encampment to another, continued its rhythmic clang. Specialist Miller, now a skilled artisan in his own right, worked tirelessly alongside him, their partnership a testament to shared purpose and quiet defiance. They trained other mechanics in the art of forging and tempering, passing on the intuitive knowledge of material strength and practical engineering that Finch had discovered out of sheer necessity. These new recruits, initially skeptical, quickly came to trust the rough-hewn pins more than any factory-made component. They had seen them hold when others failed. The impact on the battalion's morale was profound. Knowing that even when official supplies failed, there was an immediate, reliable solution, instilled a quiet confidence in the tank crews. They pushed harder, drove further, with a renewed belief in their ability to overcome mechanical failures. The rusted nail wasn't just a repair, it was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the ingenuity of the common soldier, a defiant answer to the overwhelming forces of attrition and bureaucracy. Lieutenant Davies, though never officially reprimanded, carried the weight of his unauthorized decisions. He continued to subtly shield Finch, ensuring resources reached the clandestine forge, deftly navigating the layers of official scrutiny. His career, though not soaring, remained intact, a quiet testament to his courage in prioritizing lives over protocol. He understood that true leadership sometimes meant bending the rules, not breaking them, but adapting them to the harsh realities of the front. As the winter finally began to recede and the front lines stabilized, the demand for Finch's improvised pins gradually lessened. Official supply lines, slowly but inevitably, caught up. More robust, factory-made pins, perhaps subtly influenced by field reports of the original design's shortcomings, began to arrive. The need for Finch's forge diminished, but the lessons learned, the skills acquired, remained. Sergeant Arthur Finch never sought a promotion, never wrote a report detailing his innovation. He simply continued his work, maintaining the tanks, his keen eyes always scanning for the next problem, his hands ready for the next solution. His greatest reward was the sight of the steel behemoths, once crippled, now moving with purpose across the scarred landscape. The rhythmic churn of their tracks, no longer a sound of impending failure, had become a testament to the quiet victory of ingenuity over adversity. The story of the rusted nail became a legend whispered among the veterans of the 3rd Armored Battalion, a tale of resourceful courage that transcended official narratives. It was a reminder that in the crucible of conflict, true heroes often emerged not from ranks of command or the halls of power, but from the quiet determination of individuals who simply refused to let failure be an option. Sergeant Finch, the anonymous mechanic, had not changed the course of the war, but he had, in his own quiet way, ensured that an entire tank battalion kept moving for 3 critical days, saving countless lives and securing a vital objective, a silent, enduring victory for the human spirit.